Welcome to the induction videos. Today I'm going to have a look at changing the subject of a formula. So the aim of all of these questions is to make x the subject of a formula, and to do that we want to end up with x on its own. Things which can be a problem is having negative x's or having fractions. So if we have negative x's or fractions, we're going to try and get rid of them first, but otherwise we're just going to do inverses to get x on its own. So if I have a look at y equals 4x plus 3, what I'm doing to x is I'm taking x. The first thing I'm going to do, thinking about my order of operations, is I'm timesing it by 4. And then the last thing I'm going to do is I'm adding 3, and then I'm ending up with y. What I want to do is I want to do the opposite of that all the way through. So the first thing I'm going to do is get rid of the plus 3, and then I'm going to get rid of the times by 4. So let's have a go. If I do, well, I need to get rid of the plus 3. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to subtract 3 from both sides. So if I do that, on the left-hand side I get y minus 3, and on the right-hand side I get 4x plus 3 minus 3, and that just leaves me with 4x. Now I want to get rid of the times by 4, so I'm going to do the inverse of times by 4, which is divide by 4, and I'm going to do that on both sides, which gives me y minus 3 over 4 equals x. I've got x on its own. That's the aim of changing the subject of a formula. Let's have a look at another example. So now we have y equals 2 minus 5x. If you remember at the start, I said we don't want to have a minus in front of our x. It makes things harder than it needs to be. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to try and sort out this minus 5x. I'm going to do that by adding 5x to both sides of my equation. And when I do that, I get y, well, we've added 5x, so plus 5x, equals, and now I'll get 2 minus 5x plus 5x, my 5x cancels. And now I can say I need to get rid of my y, because I'm still ending up with x on its own. So to do that, I'm going to take away y from both sides. On my left-hand side, I'm going to get 5x, and on the right-hand side, I'm going to get 2 minus y. And then finally, I need to get rid of this times by 5. I'm going to do the inverse of times by 5. I'm going to divide by 5 on both sides of my equal signs. So I get x equals 2 minus y divided by 5. All right, here's a wordy question. We've got to not be put off by it. Just carry on as it was before. The formula C equals 5 F minus 32 over 9 is used to convert between Fahrenheit and Celsius. Rearrange it to make F our Fahrenheit the subject. So this is where this sort of thing crops up in real life. Again, I'm going to think about what I'm doing to F, and I'm going to do things in the opposite order to the way that they're happening to F. So I'm starting with F. The first thing I'm doing, if I know what number F is, the first thing that I do to that number is I take away 32. The second thing that I do to it is I times it by 5, and then the last thing I do to it is divide by 9. And once I've done all of those things, I will end up with my C value. So I'm going to work backwards. Whatever BIDMAS says is the first thing I should do is going to be the last thing I should do. So let's have a go at this. The first thing I need to get rid of is the divide by 9. So I'm going to times by 9 on both sides. That gives me 9c equals 5 f minus 32. The next thing I need to remove is this 5, so I'm going to divide by 5 on both sides. When I do that, I get 9 over 5c equals f minus 32. I'm not going to write in the brackets now because I've got rid of everything outside the brackets. And then finally, I need to get rid of this minus 32, so I'm going to add on 32. And that's going to give me 9 over 5c plus 32, and that's equal to my f. So I've got f equals now. I've got f on its own is equal to something in terms of f. It's probably good to write it with the f at the start, but we've seen the maths behind it. Now I suggest that you pause the video, have a go at these questions. They're in your booklet. The answers are at the back of the booklet. I'm sure you'll be fine. Just take it slowly. Remember to do it in the opposite order of the way that you'd be doing BIDMAS, and get rid of fractions early on. Right, now we get on to more complicated things. So not linear expressions now. We have x squared plus y squared equals w squared, and we're trying to make x the subject of our formula. So again, if I think about what's happening to x, I'm taking x, I'm squaring it, then I'm adding y squared, and I'm ending up with w squared. So I'm going to do the opposite. I'm going to do the last thing that I do to my x. Well, the last thing I did was I added y squared, so that's going to be the first thing that I undo. So I'm going to subtract y squared from both sides. I get x squared equals w squared minus y squared. And now I'm going to square root my equation, because square root is the inverse of squaring. So I'm going to square root both sides. This is something which really confuses A-level students. If I'm square rooting something, I know that there's a positive version of it or a negative version of it. So I'm going to put in plus or minus in front of my square root to show that there's a positive and a negative square root. Just the square root on its own, I would assume to be positive, so I need that in there. And we're going to write w squared minus y squared. Now, here's something to think about. Can I simplify this? There's something very instinctive where we go, I've got squareds under a square root, and I've got a square root there, but I have this minus, and it's like Pythagoras. I know that if I had 5 squared minus 4 squared, that is equal to 3 squared. But 5 squared minus 4 squared square rooted is equal to 3. So here I've got something like we had before. This is like this line. And when I think about it, I can't say 5 minus 4 is equal to 3. That's not right. So I cannot cancel the square root and the squares. I just have to leave it how it is. So just be really, really careful with that. It's a really common mistake. That's why it's in this booklet. Now we're asked to make A the subject of this formula. Again, I'm going to think about what I'm doing to A. So the first thing I do to A is I times it by 5, then I divide it by h, then I square root it, then I times by a quarter. So the first thing I'm going to undo is I'm going to undo the times by a quarter, and the inverse of times by a quarter, well, I could divide by a quarter, but dividing by a quarter is the same as timesing by 4, so I'm going to times by 4 on both sides. So when I do that, I'm going to end up with 4t equals the square root of 5a over h, and then I get, well, now I need to get rid of the square root, so I'm going to do the inverse of square rooting, which is squaring. So that gives me 4t squared. Well, 4t squared is 16t squared equals 5a over h. And now the next thing I'm doing is I'm dividing by h, so I'm going to do the inverse of that, which is times by h. So that gives me 16t squared h equals 5a. Finally, I'm going to do the inverse of times by 5, which is divide by 5, and that gives me a equals 16t squared h over 5. Alright, so these ones are a little bit trickier. Each of these questions we're trying to make t the subject. So you've got lots of different letters in there, but t's the important one to concentrate on. Again, pause the video, take your time, work through the exercise, and then check your answers in the back of your induction booklet. Right, now we get on to the really tricky ones. What makes these so tricky is we're making t the subject, and I have 2 t's in my equation. So the aim of these ones is to get all my t's onto the same side, and then I can factorise. So because I'm aiming to get all my t's onto the same side, and here I've got minus t, and we said we don't like having minuses, So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to add xt to both sides. So I'm going to add xt to both sides, and that will get rid of my xt on the left hand side, and I'll just be left with a equals b plus yt plus xt. Now I've got my t's all on the same side, I can factorise, so I can say a equals b plus, and now I have a t and I have y plus x. And you can check this. It's always worth checking once you factorise something, it expands to give you what you want. So I've got my b there. Now if I do t times y, I get yt, and t times x gives me xt. So I'm good for what I want. Now, if we think about what I'm doing to t, I'm starting with my t, I'm timesing it by y plus x, then I'm adding b, and then I'm getting to my answer. So the first thing I'm going to undo is this plus b. So I'm going to subtract b from both sides, and I get a minus b equals t y plus x. And then finally, to get t on its own, I'm going to divide by y plus x. And that will give me a minus b over y plus x. Again, here we have a w and a w. So we want to make w the subject. So we want to get both our w's onto the same side, and then I can factorise. Again, because I've got a minus w on this side, it's nice if I can make it positive, so I'm going to add w to both sides as my first step. I'm going to write this slightly differently. You'll find it really beneficial to be confident with fractions when you're doing your A-levels. So I'm going to write it like this, and hopefully you can see that a over 2b times w is the same as wa over 2b. I'm going to add w to both sides. So I get t equals a over 2b w plus w. And now I can factorise. So I've got w in each part, and then I'll get a over 2b plus 1. And now I can divide by my a over 2b plus 1, which gives me t over a over 2b plus 1. Now, I don't really like having a fraction inside a fraction, and we know that if I times the top and bottom of a fraction by the same thing, it stays the same. So I'm going to finish this off by writing it as, I'm going to multiply top and bottom of this fraction by 2b. So on the top I'm going to get 2b times t, and on the bottom I'm going to get, well, a over 2b times 2b just leaves me with a, and then 1 times 2b is a plus 2b. It just looks a bit nicer. This bit wouldn't necessarily be wrong, but I'd really recommend trying to leave your answers in as nice a form as you can. It's good maths. Alright, so here are some more questions. Again, each of these have multiple x's, so be careful as you're working through it. Try to get all your x's on one side so you can factorise. On question 3, your x's are already on one side, but we have fractions in there, and again, we don't like having fractions, so you need to get rid of a fraction first by multiplying both sides by 5x minus 2, and then you can do your factorising. These questions are tricky, so take your time. If you do have any real queries, I'm sure you can find many similar questions online. Certainly my maths can help you through these. And that's it. I hope that's been really helpful to you. And you're now going to be experts at rearranging formulae when you get to doing your A-level maths.